On Wednesday, Camille Cosby will testify at a deposition for a civil lawsuit filed against her husband in 2014 by 7 women who alleged some form of sexual misconduct. Camille Cosby's testimony will come 1 week after her husband was arrested and charged with aggravated indecent assault stemming from an allegation of drugging and sexual misconduct in 2004, a case that was reopened last year by a newly elected prosecutor. Now, one of Cosby's attorneys, who is seen in this video escorting him to his arraignment Wednesday, has called her client the victim of political football and says his defense team will not consider a plea deal. Cosby and his attorneys have long denied allegations of drugging and sexual misconduct. Up until last week, he had not been charged with any crime. Joining me now is Laura Coates, a former assistant U.S. attorney connected with Bill Cosby or any of his accusers. Laura, good to have you on with us this Sunday morning.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about the prosecutor and the challenges that they will face. What challenges, if any, does the prosecution face in proving Cosby guilty?
Well, you know, in any of the sexual assault cases that I've ever prosecuted, and across the country people have the same phenomenon, is that you have a hurdle of victim blaming in rape cases and sexual assault cases where the credibility of the victim is always on trial. But more importantly, that particular level of credibility is also coming into question when you have delayed reporting. In this particular case, you don't have physical evidence, you don't have eyewitnesses. All you have is her word against his. And certainly his word has been tarnished over the 50 or more people who have alleged to have had sexual assaults with Bill Cosby, but there still remains the fact that the significant hurdle is they've got to prove something that happened 12 years ago without physical evidence and when the woman reported over a year after it happened.
One of my colleagues spoke with criminal defense attorney Thomas Mazzaro yesterday. He, too, has no connection to this case. He made the point of how Cosby's attorneys will attempt to attack the credibility of the accusers. Take a listen to what he said.
This is going to be tried in a conservative part of Pennsylvania. I grew up in New York and New Jersey, okay? You may see some conservative women looking at some of these women who 40 years ago were aspiring models in Hollywood, Playboy centerfolds, whatever they were, and they may be questioning their modus operandi, they may be questioning their behavior, questioning their values, and I think the defense is going to do a tremendous job investigating who these women are, and more importantly, who they were 40 years ago.
So, Laura, if I can, what's your reaction and what can prosecutors do to combat this type of scrutiny? I mean, is this trial, do you think, going to come down to just simply a character assessment of both the accuser and the defendant?
It will come down to character, but his point would be much more appropriate if we're talking about the victim in this case having been one of the women he's talking about. We're talking about a woman who was in the athletic department of Temple University, was not somebody who was vying for public attention, was not in the forefront, was not a Playboy model or anything else. We're talking about somebody who was lured under the pretense of having a career suggestion or a career conversation, and she was a mentee. So his point is well noted that we do attack the credibility of sexual assault victims in this country. However, what his point to is the fact that the prosecution is going to have to try to buttress the credibility of this particular victim by adding testimony of the other alleged victims. Not all 50 of them, but certainly part of them. And the reason for that is because you're able in some of these cases to say, look, this is a theme. It's a pattern of behavior. It's not an isolated incident. It's an aberration of character, but more than that, this is a modus operandi. This is his thing, to give somebody a substance and then take advantage of. That's their claim as a prosecution. So it will come into play when you're trying to assess the credibility of those women who may testify. But frankly, his point is irrelevant and lost on this particular victim.
Given that we've learned about what led this new prosecutor to bring the charge against Cosby, what would you focus on if you were arguing this case before a jury?
If I was the prosecutor, I would argue in the fact that we're not talking about the victims that are in the court of public opinion who came decades later to talk about Bill Cosby's alleged acts against them. We're talking about somebody who, within a year, it wasn't immediate, but within a year, reported to the criminal prosecutor in this case, and she went along and was steadfast to have a civil suit. I would focus on the fact that, frankly, when a woman is attacking a person for or saying that she's a victim of sexual assault, She doesn't say that Bill Cosby has sexually raped her in the sense that we were talking about. We're talking about a digital penetration and the fondling of breasts and the forcing of her to touch his then erect penis. And so we're talking about a situation where she doesn't go as far as the other victims. And so frankly, her credibility is even more heightened than the others because it seems as though she is trying to be as truthful and not exaggerate perhaps. And so I think my strategy as a prosecutor would be to say, I've got a timely disclosure of a woman who frankly had nothing to gain and everything to lose. And she went and tried to pursue her case in criminal court and was confounded by a prosecutor who didn't care.
All right, former U.S. Attorney Laura Coates, thank you very much for joining us live from Washington, D.C.
Thank you.
What's the next move for law enforcement after a federal building in Oregon is swarmed by armed protesters? We'll hear from a former ATF agent at the top of the hour. Plus this.